The seal at my throat had been cold my whole life. It woke the moment we crossed into the ashen hollow, and I nearly turned my horse for home. I did not turn. A king does not flinch in front of his own guard, and I had ridden 3 days over the gray moor to do a thing I hated, and hating it would not make it undone. So I kept my hand off the stone at my breast and my face still, and I told myself it was the cold wind funneling up the cliff gap that I felt against my skin, and not the old gray moon seal my grandfather had worn to his grave and his father before him, the seal that had never once, in the whole telling of our line, been anything but a dead gray weight. "Foul place," said Aldous behind me. He was my war second and my oldest living friend, and he had no gift for holding his tongue. "You can smell them from the ridge, my king. The cast-out breed like rabbits and rot like meat." "They are still ours," I said. "They were ours. We put them out for a reason." We had. That was the whole shame of the hollow, and the reason I had come to it myself instead of sending a steward with a writ. Valemark is a hard kingdom, stone and heather and a gray sky 9 months of the year, and hard kingdoms make hard laws, and the hardest of ours was the old one, that a wolf who shamed the pack was not killed but sent down into the ashen hollow to live out their days among the others shamed, forgotten, tithed once a season for their bread and otherwise unseen. My grandfather had filled that valley. My father had kept it, and I, who had told myself as a young man that I would empty it and be remembered kindly for it, had done nothing of the sort, because a young king learns quickly that mercy costs coin, and coin is the one thing a gray kingdom never has enough of. So I had let it stand, and now the tithe had failed 2 seasons running, and a lord of the high clans had asked me, smiling, whether his majesty meant to feed traitors out of the crown's own store while honest wolves went thin, and I had ridden down myself to see what the hollow was and decide what to do with it, because I did not trust the smiling lord's answer, and I did not trust my own from the comfort of my hall. The trail dropped through the cliff gap, and the hollow opened below us, and it was not what I had built in my mind. I had expected a midden, a den of the broken. What lay under us in the gray afternoon light was a valley of low turf-roofed houses banked against the wind, terraces of stubborn barley climbing the south slope, goats on a tether, a mill wheel turning slow in a peat-brown stream. Smoke stood straight from a dozen chimneys. It was poor, poorer than any holding in my kingdom, poorer than places I would have been ashamed to own, but it was not rot. Someone had made a life down here out of the crown's leavings, and made it with care, and the care of it struck me harder than squalor would have. The seal at my throat pulsed once, like a heart taking a beat, and went warm. I stopped my horse. "My king," said Aldous. "Nothing," I said. "It was not nothing. I am a man who has held a blade through a night-long shield wall and not shaken. I do not startle. But I sat my horse at the head of the cliff trail with a warm stone at my breast that had been cold since the day it was hung on me at 9 years old over my father's coffin, and for a moment I could not make my hand let go of the rein. Then a bell rang below, a thin cracked note, someone striking an old plowshare hung from a post, and the hollow saw us, and I watched a valley of the cast-out do the one thing I had not braced for. They did not run. They did not cower. They gathered their children in, and they gathered themselves, and they came out into the open ground before the mill to meet their king standing, the way free wolves meet what is coming rather than what they have chosen. We rode down. They made a rough half-circle, 100 of them, maybe more, old exiles gone white, younger ones born down here who had never shamed anything, who had inherited the hollow the way I had inherited the crown, by the accident of their blood. An old man stood a pace forward of the rest, straight-backed, a staff in his hand, a face like weathered oak. He did not bow. He inclined his head, which is a different thing, and I found I respected it. "You're the king," he said, "not a question." "I am Rydian," I said, "and you are." "Called Mabon these 40 years. I keep what order there is to keep." "Then we'll speak. You and I." I swung down from my horse, and behind me I heard Aldous make a low sound, because a king does not put his own boots on cast-out ground. and I ignored him, because the seal was warm against my throat and I did not know why. And standing above these people on horseback while I did not understand what was happening in my own chest felt suddenly like cowardice dressed as dignity. That was when I saw her. She was not in the half-circle. She came from the far side of the mill at a walk that did not hurry, wiping her hands on a cloth. A woman perhaps 25 with dark hair bound back off a plain, steady face. Not a soft face, not a court beauty's face, but the kind you would want beside you in a hard hour. A face with no fear in it and no performance in it either. She had a healer's leather apron and a healer's forearms, corded and scarred with small burns, and she came up beside old Mabon and set her hand on his shoulder. Not to hold him back, I understood a moment later, but to steady him, because his straight back cost him, and she knew it, and she was the one who knew. And the seal at my throat, which had been warm, came alive. I have no better word. It was as if a coal had been slipped under my collarbone. Not pain. I want to be plain about this, because in the retelling men always reach for pain, and it was not pain. It was recognition. It was the feeling of hearing your own name called across a crowded hall in a voice you have not heard since childhood, the whole body turning before the mind has decided to. My hand went to the stone before I could stop it, and I felt it burning gently under my palm, and I looked at a Poison Valley healer with burns on her arms and a cloth in her hands, and something in the deepest floor of me that I had bricked over years ago cracked straight up the middle. She met my eyes. She did not look away, and she did not drop into the flutter that court women do. She looked at me the way you look at weather coming, measuring it, deciding what it would cost. "You've come about the tithe," she said. Her voice was low and level. "It failed because the blight took the barley 2 years running, not because we're hoarding. You can walk the fields yourself. There's nothing under the floors but children." "Neve," said Mabon low, "a warning, careful." "He can see it or he can be told it," she said, not unkindly, not taking her eyes off me. "I'd rather he saw." Neve, her name was Neve. I am telling you that I stood in a valley of the disgraced with my heart's own seal burning against my breast, and I could not have told you the tithe from the price of tin. Every ordering thing in me had gone to water. I had come down to that hollow to decide a cold question of coin, and instead I was standing in front of a woman I had never seen in my life, while the oldest object of my house woke against my skin to say a thing it had no words for her, at last her. And I did not understand it, and I could not deny it, and both of those were true at once, and neither would let go. "Show me the fields," I said. She showed me the fields. She walked me the south terraces herself, Mabon coming slow behind on his staff, my guard trailing with their faces shut. She knelt in the barley and pulled a stalk and split it with her thumbnail and showed me the black thread of rot running up the green heart of it, and told me the name of the blight and the 3 things she had tried against it, and the 1 thing left she meant to try. And she spoke of it the way a captain speaks of a war he intends to win, not hopping, planning. She was not asking me for pity. She was showing me a problem and her hands already at work on it, and letting me draw my own conclusions about whether that was a valley of hoarders. "You're the healer here," I said. "I'm what there is." "Who taught you?" A small pause. Mabon taught me letters and reckoning. The healing I found out mostly on my own from an old herbal that came down the valley and from being wrong a great many times. She held up a forearm, showing the pale seams of old burns without shame. "You learn the fire by getting burned. There's no other way that I've found. And your people, your mother, your father." The pause was longer this time. When she answered, her voice had not changed, but something behind it had gone very still, the way a pool goes still. "I don't have any," she said. "I was left here. Mabon found me on the millstone as an infant, wrapped in a blanket with no mark and no name. The hollow raised me between them. So I'm outcast born, that's the word your clans use, born of no one in a valley of the cast out." She met my eyes again, level as ever. "I've heard it said that makes me the lowest thing in your kingdom. I've stopped arguing it. I have children down here who will live or die by whether I beat this blight, and I don't have the hours to spend on what your high wolves think I'm worth." Behind me, quiet but not quiet enough, Aldous said something to another guardsman, a word, outcast born, and a short breath of a laugh, the reflexive contempt of a high wolf who has never once questioned the ladder he stands near the top of. Neve did not react. She had heard it 1,000 times. It slid off her like rain off oiled leather. But I turned. I turned on my own war second in the middle of a blighted barley field, and whatever was in my face stopped his laugh in his throat, because I had not looked at Aldous like that in 20 years of friendship, and he had the sense to go pale and silent. I did not have words for why. I could not have stood in that field and told my oldest friend, "The seal my grandfather wore to his grave has woken for this woman, and I would sooner strike you than let you laugh at her." It would have sounded like a fever. It half was one. So I said only, cold and flat, "You will keep a civil tongue on my ground, and every stone of my kingdom is my ground, including this." And I turned back to the barley and knelt in it beside her, king or no king, and said, "Tell me the last thing you mean to try, the thing you haven't tried yet." And Neve, who had watched all of it with those measuring eyes, looked at me for a long moment as if I had done something that did not fit the shape of the king she had braced for. Then she told me about the seed fire, an old method from the herbal, burning the blighted stubble to ash and sowing back through the ash into clean ground the next spring, a gamble that cost you a whole season's planting for the chance of a clean one after. A gamble a starving valley could not afford without help, and would not be given help, because who spends the crown's grain to carry outcasts through a fallow year? "How much grain," I said, "to carry the hollow through a fallow season while you burn and resow?" She told me a number. It was not a large number. It was, against the crown's store, nothing, a rounding error, the cost of a single feast I had thrown and forgotten. And I understood, kneeling in the black-threaded barley with a warm stone at my breast, that the reason it had never been spent was not that it could not be spared. It was that no one who could spend it had ever come down into the hollow and knelt in the dirt and asked the right question of the right person. The ledger had decided these people were not worth a rounding error, and the ledger had never once had to look Neve in the face. "You'll have it," I said. Mabin's staff shifted on the stones. Neve went very still. "Say that again," she said, slowly, "so I don't mistake it and hope for a thing you didn't mean." "You'll have the grain to carry the hollow through a fallow year," I said, "sent from the crown's own store under my seal before the first frost. Burn your fields, re-sow in the spring. I want to see this valley's barley in 2 years, and I want it clean." For the first time, something moved in her face that was not measurement. It was not gratitude. I do not think she had much practice at gratitude, having been given so little to practice on. It was more like alarm, as if a thing she had long ago decided never to want had just been set down in front of her, and she did not know where to put her hands. "Why?" she said. It was the honest question, and I did not have an honest answer I could say aloud. "Because a stone at my throat woke for you. Because I do not understand what is happening to me, and I am a man who solves what he does not understand by staying close to it. Because your face has no fear in it, and your hands have no cruelty in them, and I have ruled a fearful, cruel kingdom for 20 years, and I did not know until this hour how starved I was for the sight of someone who was neither." I could say none of that. "Because it's owed," I said instead, which was true and was also a coward's fraction of the truth. "Because I let a ledger tell me what a valley of my own people was worth, and I didn't come and look, and that's a failing in a king. I've looked now." She held my eyes a moment longer, weighing that too, and whatever she decided she kept to herself. But she nodded once, the way Mabin had inclined his head, an acknowledgement between equals, not a subject's thanks, and she said, "Then you'll want to see the sick before you ride. If you're going to spend the crown's grain on us, you should know what you're buying. It isn't only barley down here that the blight's taken." She took me to the long house at the head of the hollow, where the failing were kept. I will not dwell on all of it. There were fevers there, and a wasting cough that had gone through the valley the winter before and left it thinner, and an old woman with a growth in her that Neve could ease but not cure, and Neve moved among them the way I move among my war band, knowing each by name and history, her voice dropping to something warmer than she had ever used on me, a hand laid to a forehead here, a cup held to lips there. The cast-out reached for her as she passed the way drowning men reach for a rope. Whatever the hollow was, it was hers, and it loved her, and she carried the whole weight of it without once seeming to notice she was carrying anything at all. At the far end, on a low cot, lay a boy of perhaps 10 with his legs splinted and packed, sweating with fever, and Neve knelt by him and unwrapped the splint with those scarred, careful hands, and I saw the wound beneath a break gone bad, the skin around it hot and shining, the red creeping, and I saw her face change. Only for a heartbeat. Only enough that I, who had spent an afternoon learning to read her, could see it. She thought she was going to lose him. "The rot's in the bone," she said quietly to me, because Mabon had gone to fetch water and there was no one else to say it to. "I can cut and I can burn and I can pray to whatever's listening. I've done it twice. Once it took, once it didn't." She looked up at me, and for the first time the fearlessness in her face had a crack in it, a hairline of exhaustion running under the steady surface, and I understood that she was not without fear at all. She simply spent all of it here on the cot side and had none left over for King's. "His mother's dead. I'm what he has. If you're going to send your grain, send it before the frost, because I'd like this valley to have something good to remember this winter by, whichever way this goes." And I, Rydian, king of Valemark, who had not knelt for anyone since the day they set the crown on me, knelt down on the packed floor of a cast-out sick house, across a fevered boy from a woman I had known for the length of an afternoon, and I said, "Tell me what you need me to hold." She blinked at me. "You want to cut and burn," I said. "You need hands, tell me what to hold." For a long moment she just looked at me across that boy, and the warm stone burned quietly against my breast, and something passed between us in the lamp smoke that I have never in my life managed to put into a word. Then she reached me a strap of leather and said, "His shoulders. He'll fight it. Don't let him move." And I set my hands on a dying outcast boy's shoulders, and Neve took up her knife, and we went to work together in the failing light. A king and a woman the whole of my kingdom had agreed was worth nothing, saving a life the ledger had never bothered to count. We did not lose him, not that night. I rode out of the Ashen Hollow after dark, against every custom of safe travel, because I could not have stayed in that valley another hour without saying aloud the thing I did not understand, and I was not ready to say it. The seal cooled as we climbed the cliff trail, not cold again, not the dead gray weight of my whole life before, but banked, like a fire you have covered for the night and know you will uncover in the morning. And I knew, riding the Black Moor road home with Aldous silent and afraid beside me, that I would uncover it, that I would find a reason to ride back to the hollow, and another after that, and that the cold, clean life I had made for myself, a king who had long ago stopped waiting for a mate, who had folded that hope up small and put it away where it could not ache, was over. Something had reached into the bricked over floor of me and cracked it, and there was no laying the stone back down. I did not yet know what she was. I want to be honest about the order of it, because later men would say I claimed her because of her blood, and it is a lie, and I will spend the rest of my life calling it a lie. The seal woke for her before I knew a single thing about her blood. It woke for a Poison Valley foundling with burns on her arms and no name and no people, kneeling over another woman's dying child, and it was her it woke for, not her line, not her lost name, not the truth that was still a season and a secret away from surfacing. Her. When I learned the rest, when the whole of it broke open before the assembled clans, and the gray moon seal did the thing no living wolf had ever seen it do, it changed everything about the kingdom and nothing at all about what I already knew. But that is further on. That night I only rode home under a scatter of hard gray stars with a banked fire at my throat and a woman's level voice in my ears. Why? And no answer I was yet brave enough to give her. And the last thing I saw before the cliff gap closed behind me was the hollow's chimney smoke standing straight in the still dark, a valley of the cast-out keeping its small fires burning, and somewhere among them the one the seal had woken for, washing a boy's fever from her hands, not knowing that the whole shape of her life, and mine, and the kingdom's had turned that afternoon on the head of a cliff trail, the moment a cold stone came warm. I found reasons to ride back to the Ashen Hollow 4 times before the first frost, and every reason was a lie I told well enough to fool my own counsel. The first time it was the grain itself. I would not send it by a steward, I said. I would see it delivered and see the fields fired, and no one dared point out that a king does not personally escort a cart of barley down a cliff trail to a valley of the disgraced. The second time it was to confirm the seed fire had taken cleanly. The third it was a boundary dispute between the hollow and the nearest high holding that I could easily have settled by writ, and did not, because settling it by writ would not have put me in the same valley air as Neve. By the fourth I had stopped bothering to invent much of anything. Aldous rode with me each time, quieter and quieter, watching me with the wary sorrow of a man who has known his friend a long time, and can see a change he does not have a name for and does not think he is going to like. He was not wrong to be wary. Each time the cliff gap opened and the hollow lay below me, the seal at my throat came warm, and each time it burned a little brighter and a little sooner, and each time I understood a little more clearly that whatever the old gray stone was doing, it was not a fever and it was not a madness. It was the truest thing that had ever happened to me, and it was pointed like a compass needle at one woman in a poor gray valley, and it did not waver. I did not touch her. I want that on the record too. Whatever the seal was singing under my collarbone, I was a king, and she was a woman with no protector but an old man and no power to refuse a king anything, and I had ruled long enough to know exactly how much a woman in her position could not say no to, and I would sooner have cut off my hand than use the smallest inch of that. So I kept my distance and I kept my hands to myself, and I found honest work to do beside her instead, because it turned out that if you gave Neve of the Hollow a king willing to actually lift and carry, she would set him to it without a shred of ceremony, and there is no better way to know a person than to work beside them at a hard task. I carried water for her fever house. I split wood. I held the seed cart's ox when the fire spooked it. I learned the hollow the way she knew it by name and by history, each low turf house and who lived in it and what they had done, long ago, to be sent down. And that was the second thing that undid me after the seal. I had come to the hollow believing it was full of traitors, and it was not. It was full of the inconvenient. There was old Bram, who had been sent down in my grandfather's day for the crime of refusing to give false witness against a rival his lord wanted ruined. There was the widow Surrey's, whose whole family had been exiled for her father's debt, a debt long since worth nothing, her children and grandchildren born into a disgrace none of them had earned. There was a whole terrace of them who were down there for nothing, but being born to someone the crown had once found troublesome. The hollow was not where Valemark put its villains. Valemark mostly forgave its villains if they were highborn and useful. The hollow was where Valemark put the people it found easier gone, and then, over 3 generations, taught itself to call them base, so that it would not have to feel the shape of what it had done. Neve knew all of it. She carried every story in that valley the way she carried the sick, without complaint, without letting the weight of it bend her, and without once pretending it was just. When I asked her, one gray afternoon splitting wood beside her, whether she hated the crown that had made the hollow, she stopped and leaned on her axe and considered it honestly, the way she considered everything. She said, when I was young. There's a certain age where you learn what you are in the eyes of the world above the cliff, and it burns like the blight. I spent a year of my life hatting your grandfather's memory and your father's and yours, king I'd never seen for a valley you'd never visited. She set another log on the block. Then a child took a fever, and I found I didn't have room to carry the hate and the child both, so I put the hate down. It was too heavy and it never once healed anybody. She split the log clean. I don't hate you, Rydian. I don't have the hours, But don't mistake that for thinking you've done right by us. You haven't, your house hasn't, and a cart of grain doesn't square 3 generations. It only means this winter's children live. That's worth doing. It isn't the same as being forgiven. No one had spoken to me like that in 20 years. My counsel flattered me. My lords maneuvered around me. My warband obeyed me and loved me in the rough way of men who have bled beside each other, but even they weighed their words in front of the crown. Neve weighed nothing. She told me the exact truth as she saw it, with no fear of me and no want from me, and I found I would have ridden the cliff trail 100 times for it alone, seal or no seal. A king spends his life among people managing him. To stand in front of someone who simply would not, who looked at the crown and saw a man, and told the man the truth, was like coming up out of deep water into air. No, I said, it isn't the same as being forgiven. I know it. And then, because she had given me the truth, I gave her a piece of my own I had never said aloud. I stopped thinking I'd ever do anything a person might want to forgive me for, somewhere in the middle of the years. You take the crown at 9, over your father's coffin, and every choice after that is the least bad one, the cheapest one, the one that keeps the kingdom from breaking, and you look up one day and you're 40 and you've never once done a thing because it was good, only because it was needed, and you can't remember what the difference felt like. I split a log badly and did not care. Carrying your hollow through a fallow year is the first thing I've done in a decade that I did because it was good. Not needed. Good. So don't tell me a cart of grain squares nothing. To me, it's the first clean thing I've touched in years, and I'm not ready to have it called nothing. She looked at me for a long moment across the woodpile, and something in her measuring gaze shifted. Not softened exactly. Neve did not soften, but opened, a fraction. A door left ajar that had been shut. All right, she said quietly. Not nothing. I'll give you that. A pause. It's a strange king who argues to be told he's done less good than he thinks instead of more. I've had my fill of being told I've done more. Something almost like a smile touched her mouth then, the first I had seen. It was gone as fast as it came, but I carried it home over the black moor like a coal in my hands. It was on the 4th ride down that the buried thing first showed its edge. The boy Ailed, the one whose leg we had saved together that first night, was mending, running on the terraces again with a limp that would fade, and his gratitude had turned into a 10-year-old's fierce devotion. He shadowed Neve everywhere and me whenever I came, having decided the king who had held his shoulders through the worst night of his life was the finest wolf in the world. It was Ailed who said it, artless, the way children say the things adults have learned to step around. We were at the millstone, the great flat wheel of granite where the hollow ground what little grain it had. And Ailed was perched on the edge of it kicking his mending leg, and he said to Neve, "Show him where they found you. Show the king." Neve went still in a way I had learned to read. He doesn't need to see that. But it's the millstone. You were right here. Ailed patted the granite beside him, delighted with the romance of it. Mabon says you were wrapped in the good blanket, the gray one with the pattern, and there was no note and no name, just you, and everybody said send her up the cliff, foundlings are bad luck, and Mabon said no, and that's why you're the healer and not dead in a ditch. Isn't that right? That's the shape of it, Neve said, in a voice meant to close the subject. But I had gone still myself, because a word had caught in me like a hook. The blanket, I said. The gray one with the pattern, is it kept? Neve looked at me sharply. Why? Is it kept, Neve? Something in my voice made her answer plainly. Mabon has it. He kept it. He said if anyone ever came looking for me, it'd be the one thing to know me by. A hardness came into her face, an old scar tissue hardness. No one ever came looking. 25 years no one came. So it's a blanket in a chest, and it's the closest thing I have to a mother, and I'd thank you not to make a king's game of it. I'm not making a game of it, I said, and I heard how strange my own voice sounded. Neve, I need to see the blanket. I swear to you on the crown it isn't idle and it isn't cruelty. Something you've said has, I need to see it. She stared at me a long moment. Then she called to Ailed to fetch Mabon, and the old man came slow on his staff, and when Neve told him what I asked, his weathered oak face did something complicated. A flinch, a wariness, and under both of those, so quick I almost missed it, a flare of something that looked terribly like hope long ago buried and afraid to be dug up. He brought the blanket himself, from a cedar chest in his own house, wrapped in oilcloth against the damp. He unwrapped it on the millstone in the gray light with hands that shook, and shook not from age. And I looked down at a square of fine gray wool, worn soft with years, and woven through it in silver thread gone dull with time was a pattern I had known my whole life. The pattern that ran the border of every banner in my hall, that was carved above the door of my grandfather's tomb, that was pressed into the wax of every writ I had ever sealed. The waning moon over 3 peaks, the mark of the gray moon line, my own house, my own blood. The seal at my throat, which had been warm the whole afternoon, flared so hard I gasped. "Where," I said, and my voice was not a king's voice, it was cracked straight through, "did this come from, Mabon, where?" The old man lowered himself onto the millstone as if his legs had stopped holding him. He looked at Neve, one long, aching look, the look of a man about to set down a weight he had carried for a quarter century and was terrified to let go of, and then he looked at me. "I never knew whose it was," he said. "I swear it before you, King. 25 years I've looked at that pattern and known it was fine work, high-born work, and told myself it meant nothing because to let it mean something was to hope, and hope in the hollow is a knife you turn on yourself." His voice shook. She was 3 days old, maybe 4. It was the worst winter in living memory, the pass above the cliff gap closed, the moor road buried, no one in or out for a month. And on the coldest night of it, in a storm you couldn't stand up in, someone came down the cliff trail. Someone who should not have been able to. And they left an infant on the millstone wrapped in that blanket, and they left before I reached the door, and by morning the snow had taken every track. No note, no name, just a high-born blanket and a baby who by every law of that cold should have been dead by dawn and wasn't. "That's not possible," Aldous said behind me, low and unsteady. He had come up close, drawn by the pattern, his soldier's face gone gray. "My king, the winter he means the great closing that was 25 years back. I was a boy, but I remember it. Nothing crossed that pass. Nothing. Whole holding starved, cut off. A man on foot in that storm couldn't have made the cliff gap alive, let alone carrying in." He stopped. He looked at Neve. He looked at the moon over peaks in the silver thread. And I watched my hard old war second do the arithmetic and go white to the lips. Because I was doing it too. 25 years back, the great winter, and the thing no one in Valemark spoke of, the wound at the root of my own house that the whole kingdom had agreed to leave scabbed over. 25 years back, in that same closing winter, my uncle, my father's younger brother, the one who had wanted the crown and not gotten it, had risen in the last revolt my house had ever faced. It had ended in fire and grief. My uncle had died on the walls. His holding had burned. And his wife, who was said to have been carrying a child, had vanished in the chaos of the fall along with the infant, both presumed dead in the burning, never found, never named, grieved in silence and never spoken of again because the whole affair was a shame my father took to his grave. An infant of the gray moon line, lost in the great winter, never found. I looked at Neve, at the dark hair, the level gray eyes, the straight spine, the jaw that would not bow, and for the first time I saw not a Poison Valley foundling but a face, and the face was my father's. Around the eyes, in the set of the mouth, the gray moon face that looked out of a dozen painted ancestors on the walls of my hall, looking back at me now out of a healer's weathered skin in a valley of the cast-out. "Neve," I said, my voice would barely come. "Your eyes, I could not finish it." She had gone very pale and very still, and her hands, those scarred, steady, never-trembling hands, had begun to shake where they gripped the edge of the millstone. "No," she said. "Whatever you're building in your face, King, stop it. I'm outcast born. I'm a foundling off a millstone. That's a blanket. Fine folk lose fine things. It doesn't make me." She could not say it either. The word was too large and too dangerous, and she had spent 25 years learning not to want anything that large. Don't you dare do this to me. Do you understand? I have made a life out of being no one's. I have made a peace with it. If you build a hope in me and it's wrong, if it's just a rich man's blanket and a king's fancy, you will break something in me that I have spent my whole life keeping whole. So unless you are certain, unless you can prove it, you will close your mouth and let me be what I've always been. She was right, and I was a king, and I had learned young never to promise what I could not prove. A blanket was not proof. A resemblance was not proof. The kingdom had 100 fine blankets, and my father's face was in 100 distant cousins. To claim her on a pattern and a cheekbone would be to do to her exactly the cruelty she feared, to lift her up on a maybe and let the clans tear her down on a maybe, and shatter that hard-won peace for nothing. But there was one thing in all the world that could not lie about Grey Moon blood. One thing that had been made, the oldest telling said, by the first king of my line, keyed to the blood of his descendants, so that no pretender could ever wear the crown of Valemark on a forged claim. A thing that had been cold and silent for 3 generations because the priest said the blood had thinned, the line grown weak, the old magic gone to sleep. A thing that had woken warm the moment I crossed into the ashen hollow, and burned brighter every hour I stood near this woman, and flared like a struck coal the instant her house's true mark touched the light. The Grey Moon seal at my throat. I can prove it, I said quietly. Neve, there is one thing that cannot be fooled and cannot be forged, and I have carried it against my own heart since I was 9 years old, and it has been dead gray stone my entire life, until the day I rode into this valley when it woke, and it has burned warmer every hour I've stood near you, and I did not understand why. I thought it was the mate bond alone. I think now it was more than that. I think it was knowing its own. I lifted my hand toward the seal, then stopped, because this was not a thing to do quickly, or alone, or in a woodyard. But I will not wake it here on a hope between the 3 of us, where the clans could later call it a trick I staged in secret. If I do this, I do it once in the open before the assembled houses of Valemark, so that no lord who ever spat outcast born at you can say afterward that the king dreamed it up in a valley to suit himself. I will make them all watch the stone answer. And then no wolf in this kingdom will ever be able to unsay what it shows. Neve stared at me. Mabon had begun, silently, to weep, the slow tears of a very old man who has guarded a secret for a quarter century and lived to see it matter. And Neve, my fierce, fearless, unbowed Neve, looked from the blanket to my face to the stone at my throat, and the peace she had made with being no one's cracked visibly down its whole length. And behind it I saw the thing she had buried so deep and so long ago that she had convinced herself it was dead. A child's simple, unbearable question. Whose am I? And did they mean to leave me? And would anyone ever in all the world have come looking if they'd known I was here? And if it stays gray, she whispered, if you stand me in front of your whole kingdom and lift that stone and it does nothing if it's cold, then I'm not just outcast-born anymore. I'm the outcast-born woman who let a king dress her up as a lost princess in front of every lord in Valemark and got laughed back down the cliff. You'll have taken the one thing I have, my peace with what I am. Her voice broke, and it was the first time I had ever heard it break. Why would you gamble that? Why would you make me gamble that? Because I don't believe it's a gamble, I said. Because I have carried that stone my whole life and it has never so much as flickered and it woke for you, and I have never in my life been more certain of anything. But, and here I made myself say the true and difficult thing because she had never given me anything but truth and I would not start lying to her now, but I could be wrong. The seal is proof. My certainty is not. So it must be your choice, Neve, and only yours, and I will hold to whatever you decide. If you tell me to close my mouth and let you be the healer of the hollow to the end of your days, I will ride back up that cliff and never say the word princess again, and I will still send the grain, and I will still hold the boy's shoulders, and I will still, I stopped. Love you, I did not say, not yet, not there. I will still be exactly what I've been. This does not buy you. Nothing about this is a price you pay me. It is only a door, and it is only yours to open. The hollow was very quiet. The mill stream ran. Somewhere a goat complained. Ailed, forgotten on the edge of the great stone, watched us with enormous eyes, sensing that something vast was turning and not knowing what. And Neve of the Ashen Hollow, foundling healer, the woman the whole of Valemark had agreed was worth nothing, reached out and laid one scarred, steady, no longer trembling hand flat on the gray wool of the only inheritance she had ever owned, over the waning moon, and the 3 peaks of a house that had thrown away its own without ever knowing, and she lifted her gray moon eyes to mine. "Then take me up the cliff," she said, "and we'll see what your stone says in front of all of them, but hear me, Rydian." Her chin came up, that unbowing jaw my father's jaw. "I'm not going up there to be given a name by your lords. I've had a name for 25 years. It's Neve, and the Hollow gave it to me, and whatever your stone says, I'm keeping it. If that seal wakes and I'm blood of your house, then your house has a great deal to answer for to this valley, and I'll be standing where I can finally make it answer. I'm not going up to be rescued. I'm going up to collect a debt. Do you understand the difference?" And I, who had ridden down into that hollow believing I was bringing charity to the base, and had found instead the truest person and the lost blood of my own house, and the cracked open floor of my own long-buried heart, all in one gray valley I had let my ledger forget. I looked at the woman the seal had woken for, standing straight-backed over her mother's blanket with a debt to collect from a king. And I understood that I had never in my life wanted anything the way I wanted to stand beside her when that stone woke, and let the whole of Valemark see what it had thrown away. "I understand it," I said. "Come and collect then. I'll ride beside you the whole way up." I summoned the houses of Valemark to my hall for the first full assembly in 9 years, and I did not tell them why. That silence was deliberate. If word had gone ahead that the king meant to raise a foundling from the Ashen Hollow before the crown, the clans would have arrived armored in their contempt, their answers ready, their sneers rehearsed. I wanted them unready. I wanted them to walk into my hall expecting a matter of grain or borders, and to be handed instead a thing that would break their whole ordering of the world across their knees. So the writs went out plain: "The king commands your presence." And the high wolves of my kingdom came grumbling up the moor roads through the first hard frost, and filled my long stone hall under the banners of the waning moon, and had no idea what was coming. Neve came up the cliff trail 2 days ahead with Mabon, and I housed them not as supplicants but as my guests, in the good rooms, and I set my own guard on their door, Aldous chief among them, my war second, who had gone from the man laughing outcast born in a barley field to the man who now stood watch over her threshold with his hand on his sword, and his face daring anyone to breathe wrong in her direction. He had seen the blanket. He had done the winter arithmetic. Whatever else Aldous was, he was not a fool, and he had understood before most that the ground of the whole kingdom had shifted, and he had chosen, the way old soldiers do, to plant his feet on the new ground fast and firmly rather than be caught standing on the old. Neve would not be dressed as a princess. I offered. There were gowns, there were jewels, there was every trapping the crown could hang on her, and she refused all of it with that level look. "If your stone only wakes for me in silk," she said, "then it isn't proving anything worth proving. It'll answer to who I am or it won't, and who I am wears the Hollow's own." So she stood in my hall on the day of assembly in a healer's good gray dress, clean and plain, her dark hair bound simply, her scarred forearms bare, looking exactly like what she was, a working woman of a poor valley. And I have never in my life seen anyone look more like a queen, precisely because she had refused every trick that might have made her look like one. I brought her in last, when the hall was full. The doors opened and she walked the length of my hall alone. I would not lead her by the hand. That was hers to insist on. She would enter under her own power or not at all. And I watched a room full of the highest blood in Valemark turn to look at a plain gray figure coming up the aisle. And I watched the whispers start. And I watched the whispers curdle into contempt as the nearer lords caught the hollow cut of her dress and the burns on her arms and understood, with rising outrage, what the king had apparently dragged into their midst. "Is that," someone said, not quite low enough, "that's a cast-out. He's brought a cast-out into the—" Outcast born, said another, the old reflexive venom, the word that had been a wall around her whole life. Neve did not falter. She had told me she was coming to collect a debt, not to be rescued, and she walked up my hall through a rising tide of the exact contempt that had defined her existence, with her chin level and her eyes forward and not one tremor in her, and reached the open floor before the dais where I stood, and stopped, and inclined her head to me. Not a bow, an inclination, the greeting of an equal, in front of every lord who had just called her base, and I understood the clans had seen it too. That small, unbending gesture, and that it had enraged them more than any speech could have. A lord of the high holding stood Kadok, the smiling one, the one whose sly question about feeding traitors had sent me down into the hollow in the first place, and I have often thought since that if Kadok had only kept his silence that season I might never have ridden down, never crossed the cliff gap, never felt the stone wake, and I owe that sneering man a debt he will never know he is owed. He stood now, oily and certain, and said, "My king, forgive us, but the assembly is confused. You have summoned the blood of Valemark to your hall and set before us a woman of the Ashen Hollow. The cast out are tithed and unseen by the law of your own grandfather. Are we to understand there is some new purpose in parading one before the crown? Has she some grievance the king finds amusing?" The word amusing was a blade, and he meant it to draw blood, and I let the hall sit in it a moment before I answered, because I wanted them all leaning forward. "No grievance you'd find funny, Kadok," I said. "A question, one question that I mean to answer here before all of you, so that it can never afterward be answered in a corner or unsaid. The question is, whose blood is this?" And I lifted the gray moon seal from against my heart. The hall knew it. Of course they knew it. Every lord in Valemark had seen it hanging cold at the throat of my father and his father, the dead gray stone of the first king, the proof stone, the thing the old law said no false claimant could ever wake, because it answered only to true gray moon blood, and had answered to nothing at all in living memory, its magic gone to sleep with the thinning of the line. They knew what it was, and they knew it was dead. And I watched a hall full of clever, contemptuous wolves fail entirely to understand why their king was holding a lifeless heirloom out toward a valley foundling, and I loved knowing what they did not. "The seal of the first king," I said, and I let it swing on its chain so the whole hall could see it, keyed to the blood of his line so that no pretender could ever forge a claim to Valemark. Cold in my hand my whole life, cold in my father's, cold in his father's. The priests say the old blood has thinned and the magic sleeps. Perhaps. Or perhaps, and here I looked at Neve and she looked back at me, level and pale and unbowed, and I saw her hands were steady now, steady as they had been over the fevered boy, because whatever was coming she had decided to meet it standing. Perhaps it has only been waiting for blood strong enough to wake it. There is one way in all the world to know. The seal answers to gray moon blood and to nothing else. It cannot be forged, cannot be flattered, cannot be commanded, not by me, not by any of you. It knows its own or it does not. I held it out toward her, flat on my open palm. "Neve of the Ashen Hollow, whom this hall calls outcast-born, base, worth less than a rounding error of the crown's grain, come and lay your hand on the seal of the first king, and let the stone say what you are in front of all of them, so that no wolf here can ever unsay it." The silence in that hall was a physical thing. Kadok had stopped smiling. Somewhere a bench scraped as a lord half rose and thought better of it. Old Mabon stood at the hall's edge with tears already on his weathered face, and Aldous had his hand white-knuckled on his sword hilt, and 100 of the highest wolves in the kingdom leaned forward as one to watch a cast-out healer walk toward a dead stone. Neve crossed the floor. She stopped before me, close, closer than the whole watching kingdom, and for just a breath it was only the two of us, the way it had been in the sick house with the boy between us, and she said, so low only I could hear it, "If it's cold, Rydian, you send the grain anyway. Swear it. Whatever happens to me up here, the Hollow's children eat this winter." "I swear it on the crown," I said just as low, "but it will not be cold." She held my eyes one heartbeat more. Then she lifted her scarred, steady, working hand, the hand that had split blight stalks and held fever brows and cut rot from a dying boy's bone, and she laid it flat on the dead gray moon seal in my open palm. For one endless moment, nothing. I felt the whole hall begin minutely to exhale the beginning of a sneer, the vindication of 100 lords about to be proven right. See, a foundling, a fancy, the king's madness. And then the seal woke. It did not flicker. It did not warm the way it had warmed for me across a valley. Under her palm, the gray stone of the first king came alive all at once, blazing up with a light like the moon itself caught and poured into rock, a cold silver radiance that ran up from the stone through the chain and lit her hand from within, so that I could see the bones of her fingers glowing through the skin, and lit her plain gray dress and her plain bound hair and her level unbowing face from below, until she stood in the middle of my hall, wrapped in the risen light of my whole house. The waning moon over 3 peaks, blazing on her palm for every lord and Valemark to see. The hall did not gasp. It was past gasping. It made a single low sound, 100 throats at once, the sound men make when the floor of the world tilts under them, and then it went to its knees. Not all at once. It began at the edges with the old ones, the ones who remembered the great winter and had done the arithmetic the moment the light rose. And then it ran inward through the assembly like a wind through barley, lord after lord after lord going down, the highest blood of Valemark folding to its knees before a woman they had called base 90 seconds before, because the seal of the first king had woken to her hand, and there was no arguing with it, no forging it, no unsaying it. The one proof in all the kingdom that could not lie had spoken, and it had named her gray moon, named her true blood, named her, as the arithmetic finished in every clever head at once, the lost heir of the winter, the vanished child of the burning, the one presumed dead 25 years and grieved in silence and never found. Caddoc went down last and went down gray. Neve stood in the risen light and did not kneel and did not weep and did not soften. She looked out over a hall full of the wolves who had scorned her, now folded to the floor at her feet, and I watched her take it in, not with triumph. My Neve was too large for triumph, but with something graver. The slow, terrible understanding of a woman who had spent 25 years being told she was no one, learning in a single blaze of moonlight that she had always been someone, that a whole kingdom's worth of contempt had been a lie from her first breath, that if one man had made it down a storm-locked cliff trail on the coldest night in living memory to hide her among the cast-out where no pursuer would ever think to look, then someone, long ago, in the middle of fire and grief, had loved her enough to carry her through a killing winter to keep her alive. "Someone brought me down," she said. Her voice was not loud, but the woken silence carried it to every corner. Through the great winter, when the pass was shut and the road was buried and a grown man on foot should have died in that storm, someone carried a 3-day infant down a cliff no one could climb and left me where the crown would never look and went back out into the cold. Why? If I'm the winter's heir, if I'm the child everyone said burned, then who carried me down, and why hide me, and why never come back? And it was Mabon who answered, Mabon who had guarded the whole of it a quarter century, stepping forward now on his staff into the moonlight with his old face streaming. "There was more in the blanket than you," he said, "child. I never told you because a scrap of paper with no name on it is nothing, and I would not build a hope in you on nothing. But tucked in the wool against your heart there was a folded note. Not your name, just 8 words in a hand shaking with cold." He drew it from inside his coat. He had carried it on his own body all these years, I understood, the way I carried the seal, and he unfolded a scrap of paper gone soft as cloth with age, and he read, in the risen silver light, the 8 words a dying man had left with an infant on a millstone. "Her brother lives, keep her from the fire. Her brother lives." I felt the words go into the hall like a blade, and I felt them go into me, because there was only one child unaccounted for in the great winter besides the lost heir, and every head in that hall, including my own, turned slowly, helplessly, toward the man standing white-faced at the foot of the dais with his hand frozen on his sword hilt. Aldous, my war second, my oldest living friend. The boy who had survived the great winter as a foundling himself, taken in by a soldier's family, raised to the war band, whose own blood no one had ever thought to question, because who questions the blood of a loyal sword? Aldous, who had the gray moon jaw, who had my father's brow, who had stood laughing outcast born in a barley field at his own lost sister and never known it. No, Aldous said very quietly to no one. No, I'm a soldier's foundling, I'm not. You survived the great winter, I heard myself say, taken in as an infant, no blood anyone ever named. Aldous, my voice broke on it. The note says her brother lives, and you have worn my father's face beside me for 30 years and I never once saw it because I never once had reason to look. I did not have the seal's proof for him, not that night that would come. We would wake the stone to his hand too before the moon set, and it would blaze as it had for her, and the last piece would fall, but I think every soul in that hall knew it already, in the way you know a true thing before it is proven, from the two faces turned toward each other across the moonlit floor. The fierce gray-eyed healer of the Ashen Hollow and the hard gray-eyed war second of the Crown, brother and sister carried out of the same fire by the same unknown hand. One hidden among the cast-out and one hidden in plain sight at the king's own shoulder. Both grieved as dead, both alive, both home. Neve crossed the floor to Aldous. The man who had called her base knelt, not to princess, but the way a brother kneels, all the way down, undone, and my fierce Neve who did not soften put both her scarred healer's hands on her lost brother's bowed head, and said, in a voice thick for the first time since I had known her, you held a boy's shoulders through the worst night of his life because your king asked you to. You watched my door with your sword out because you decided I mattered before you knew a drop of why. I'd have been proud of that brother even without the seal, you great fool. Get up. We've a valley full of people the Crown owes an apology, and I mean to collect it, and I'll want my brother standing when I do. That is how the exile of the Ashen Hollow ended. Not by my writ, though the writ came, that same night, by my hand and under the woken seal. The hollow unmade as a place of shame, its people restored to the free wolves of Valemark, old Bram's name cleared, and the widow Surrey's debt struck, and every unjust exile of 3 generations undone. The whole rotten law that had let my house call the inconvenient base torn out at the root. It ended truly, when the lost heir of Valemark stood in the risen light of the first king's seal, and made the kingdom's contempt kneel not to her rank, but to the plain fact of what it had thrown away, and then turned that vindication, before it had even cooled, into mercy for the valley she came from. They wanted to crown her. The clans, once they had knelt, swung hard the other way, as the contemptuous always do when the ground shifts. Suddenly every high wolf who had spat outcast-born was her devoted servant, eager to enthrone the winter's heir. Neve refused the crown. I'm no queen of yours by right of blood, she told the assembly, and I won't be one by right of a stone waking. I was raised in a valley you starved. If I'm to stand up here, it's because I chose it, and because the man who wears the other seal asked me, not because you've decided my blood makes me acceptable at last. My blood was always this. You only just found a reason to look. She married me in the spring, when the hollows resown barley came up clean and green through the ash of the burned fields. The seed fire had taken, the gamble had won, and the valley that had been a place of shame ground its first free harvest in 3 generations on the same millstone, where an old man had once found an infant in a gray moon blanket and chosen, against all law and luck, to keep her. We were wed there in the hollow, not in my hall, she insisted, and I would have insisted for her if she hadn't, with the freed people of the valley all around us and old Mabon giving her away on his staff and her brother standing at my shoulder as my war second and her kin both, and the seal at my throat warm the whole day long, not blazing, just warm, just quietly, steadily home. I have been asked since, in the way people ask, what woke the stone, The priests have their theories about thinned blood and sleeping magic and the strength of a true line. Let them. I know what woke it, and it was not her rank, and it was not the winter's lost crown, and it was not the arithmetic of the great fire. The seal woke the day I rode into a valley of the cast-out, and saw a woman with burns on her arms kneel over another woman's dying child and fight for a life the whole kingdom had agreed was worth nothing. It woke for that, for the truest heart in my kingdom, tending the least of my people in a place I had let my ledger forget. That she was also gray moon blood, the lost heir, my own house's abandoned child, only meant the stone had two reasons instead of one. But it was her heart it answered first. I will go to my grave saying so. The blood was the proof the clans needed. The heart was the truth I needed, and I had it whole before I ever knew her name was written anywhere but on a millstone. She keeps the hollow still, rides down every season, sits with the sick, teaches the healing to any child who wants it, and no one in Valemark would dare call the valley or its people base again, because the woman who came out of it wears the risen light of the first king on her hand, and the crown of the queen on her brow, and carries them both the way she carries everything, without letting the weight of them bend her, and without ever once forgetting where she was found. On the coldest night of our first winter married, a storm came down off the moor much like the one that had closed the past the year she was born. I found her at a window in the dark, looking out at the snow, and I knew where she was with an unknown someone, 25 years gone, struggling down a killing cliff trail with a 3-day child against their heart and 8 words folded into the wool. We never learned who. Some faithful servant of my uncle's house, most like, who saved what they could of the winter's children and then went back out into the cold and was never found, and asked for nothing, and got nothing, and gave everything. Neve lights a candle for them every year on that night. I light it with her. They kept me from the fire, she said, that first winter watching the snow. Whoever they were, they carried me down to the one place no one would look, and they kept me alive, and they never knew if it mattered. She leaned back against me, and I put my arms around the lost heir of Valemark, the healer of the Ashen Hollow, the truest heart in my kingdom, my wife. It mattered, she said, to the snow, to the cold, to a stranger 25 years dead. Tell them, if you're anywhere that can hear, it mattered. She lived, she came home, and she remembers. The seal at my throat was warm the whole night through.